Thanks for listening. If you like the candid discussion and are seeking the truth behind the mainstream narrative, then please subscribe and share. Not only am I grateful, but those who seek the truth and wish to empower themselves and their families' health, freedoms, and future will also be grateful. Hey, everybody. I'm here with Morley Robbins today. You all recognize him. Thanks, Morley, for being back with us today. Today, we want to talk about the continued conversation because it's so in-depth about copper. And this is referenced as the copper conundrum because there's a lot of confusion about it. In fact, as I bring it up, after looking at my own labs in comparison with many of my patients' labs, there's still so many untruths about it, or half-truths, which means we really can't see fully clear as to what it does and how its role in metabolism is, specifically with iron metabolism. So Morley, good to see you, brother.
Likewise. Good to be here.
Go ahead. You had an analogy you were just going to start to share with me about the copper conundrum.
So picture a stick pin it's about an inch high, and there's a little head on the top of the stick pin. 100 milligrams of copper is what's required to run human metabolism. And that 100 milligrams of copper regulates 5,000 milligrams of iron, and whatever the volume is of oxygen that we consume in the course of a day. This little speck of copper that can sit on the top of a stick pin is what we need in order to have balance with our iron and our oxygen. And it's the only element on planet Earth that can regulate the two forces, iron and oxygen, that create rust outside of our body and create rust inside of our body. Except we spell it differently inside the body. It's ROS, and we can add a T. The T is silent. But reactive oxygen species is what's being created inside the body, and rust is being created outside the body. So, and all you got to do is think about a fever. What's a fever? Fever is a 4% differential from ideal body temperature. Ideal body temperature, 98.6. What I think is very funny is, where did that number come from? And there was a physician at Johns Hopkins at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, who was just curious to know, what's the ideal body temperature? So he took the temperature of 100 patients in the hospital and averaged it. And it came out to 98.6, and that became the standard for humans, is 98.6. But that's a true story. But a 4% differential, and of course, being from Baltimore and nicknamed Baltimore, of course it becomes gospel. If it came out of Hopkins, it has to be gospel. But a 4% differential from ideal body temperature gets us to 102. And what is 102? That's called a fever. And we know how bad we feel when we have a fever. So picture a 4% loss of copper. So instead of having 100 milligrams, we have 96 milligrams. What if it's an 8% loss? What if it's a 20% loss? What people aren't aware of is that, there are agents in our food system and farming system that are designed to put the brakes on copper getting into our body. So, glyphosate chelates copper in the soil. So it prevents it from being in the soil, but it prevents it from getting in the root system to get into the plant, prevents it from getting into the animals, prevents it from getting into the humans. Well, then you've got things like, high fructose corn syrup that blocks copper absorption. We've got things like Tylenol, ibuprofen, that wipes out glutathione in the liver. And everyone thinks that glutathione is the master antioxidant. It's an important chemical. It's very much connected to copper chemistry, because glutathione is the greeter at the door to take copper to one of its chaperones to become enzymes inside the cell. It's a very important function. And it's, again, copper independent of its enzymes or independent of its chaperones, is volatile. It is. But the body has these elegant mechanisms and pathways to keep it under wraps and get it to where it's supposed to be so it can have the maximum impact in our metabolism, maximum impact in our immune system, and maximum impact in energizing our body. It's so hard to fathom. Go ahead.
Yeah, it amazes me as a result of all of your study. That feedback is rough.
Sorry.
So can you give me a scenario where, the opposite side, you've mentioned some docs that you've had interactions with who are unwilling to look at copper and they see it only as toxic. Can you give me some scenarios where you see copper toxicity and why the fear with having copper in your diet?
Well, probably the most notable, there are a number of people who've written about it, but I'm trying to think of his name at the University of Michigan. I'm blanking right now.
It's okay.
Yep. Hold on here, folks. Hopefully this will be worth it. George Brewer, he's now retired. He was at the University of Michigan, and he wrote extensively about copper toxicity. Water in the copper pipes is going to create Alzheimer's. The most notable person before George Brewer, though, was Carl Pfeiffer. He's passed away a number of years ago, but Carl Pfeiffer was an MD, PhD, and he wrote a very important book called Mental and Elemental Nutrients. And I believe that book was written in the early 80s. And it's an absolute beast of a book. It's probably 600 pages. But there's some real sleight of hand that's going on. So when you talk about really world-renowned copper experts like Joseph Prohaska, he used to be at the University of Minnesota, or Svetlana Lutsenko, she's at Hopkins Medical School, Garth Cooper at the University of Manchester. What they all agree on is that copper does not exist in an unbound state in the human body. The term unbound copper, and I went back to find the source reference to it, and it was Carl Pfeiffer. And what he actually said was copper unbound from ceruloplasmin. And then it got shortened to unbound copper. And then what they started to do is treat it like a Christmas tree and start putting all these ornaments of toxicity to it and say, well, it's the copper that's causing all the problems. And it's like, wait a minute, let's get into the real literature. But the thing is, if copper is not with ceruloplasmin, it's going to be attached to albumin, transcuprine, or an amino acid histidine. Those are the three most likely carriers for copper. And if it's not with ceruloplasmin, it's going to be connected with one of a couple hundred different enzymes that copper is essential to activate. The one that I learned of today, it's fascinating. Forgive my chicken scratch, but this was the find today. Cool. Decreased plasma enkephalins in copper deficiency in man. Now, what's an enkephalin? It's an opiate. And so, yeah. And so when I remember, they fed 24 men were fed a copper deficient diet. Enkephalins went south and endorphins went north. Well, that combination is the start of the sympathetic nervous response. And it's not a good thing. And so what it does is it's wiping out the chemistry in the blood, but also the chemistry in the adrenal glands from a copper deficient diet. And so I didn't know that. And very likely you didn't know that. And certainly our listeners didn't know that. So, and this is every day I find something like that. You know, I could just go on for hours just talking about the different enzymes that are requiring copper. And what the system has delighted in doing is taking what I interpret as the clear indications of oxidative stress and ascribing all of those symptoms to copper, even though there's 60 times more iron in the body, that is equally, if not more so, likely to produce oxidative stress. So again, they've transcribed the symptoms of toxicity that are really coming from iron toxicity, iron stuck in the tissue, but they've transferred it over to copper and said, that copper is really bad, but never telling people that the only reason why we're here on this planet talking on these fancy machines is because we have high IQ that requires a lot of energy in this organ called the brain. And that energy comes from mitochondria. The neurons might have as much as 2 million mitochondria per neuron. And that takes a lot of, those mitochondria got to have copper to run. And they forget to tell us all those little niggly details. And they create this very simplistic, childlike belief system that, you know, black and white, good and bad. And they've decided that copper's bad, iron's good. Well, it's not. And it's not that simple. And what I pieced together today, and we won't have a chance to go into it in our discussion, but I will send you the email. Maybe we can talk about it in our next conversation. But I'm convinced that hormone D, which we've talked about in the past, I think is a principal agent for creating anemia. And the dot connecting is very straightforward, but I think you'll be mesmerized by it. And so the average person doesn't know that. And they think, oh, vitamin D, I need sunshine. It turns out that Hector DeLuca, who is a preeminent lipidologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, you know that university, right? Yeah. You've been on that university campus. And I think there are only 3 buildings named after him. He's actually a big biochemistry guy at UW. And he wrote an article in the 1980s. And it's a very important article, incredibly important article, because there's a difference between storage D and active D, right? Storage D and active D. And everybody gets all worked up about how their storage D levels drop in the winter and rise in the summer. And they're mystified by this, but they're terrified of the thought of their storage D going low during the winter months. And I live in Pennsylvania. There's just no sunlight, and oh my gosh. So turns out the study by Dr. DeLuca, and again he's like a demigod at UW and in the world of vitamin D metabolism. But he wrote this article. I think it was either 83 or 87. I've forgotten which. I think it was 83. The active hormone has no change around the year. There's absolutely no change in active D there's no seasonal variation in active D, which is the most important metabolite. And that active D must be attached to the VDR, which must be attached to a very important nuclear receptor called RXR. And it's that threesome, that's that little triad that is creating all of the goodness in our immune system. Has nothing to do with storage D. And there's a very important sentence in this article where he's talking about the photoreceptivity of vitamin D, the storage D. And it turns out, I think I've used this analogy in earlier discussions, but the storage D is sunglasses. It's blocking sunlight. Vitamin A is the filter allowing the light in, saying, come on in, ollie in free. The retina of the eye is dependent upon retinol in the lipid, in the cod liver oil, and other forms of vitamin A, like beef liver and butter and heavy cream, things like that. But the eye, which is a light sensing being, so the vitamin A is the light sensor, and vitamin D is a light filter. And the reason why it rises in the summer is because there's more sunlight. The reason why it falls in the winter is there's less sunlight, but there is absolutely no seasonal variation in active D, which is the most important metabolite. And it blows apart the whole argument about, oh my gosh, I don't live in the right part of the world. I don't live in the equator. I'm not stark naked 6 hours a day. And it's like, relax. Calm down. And what our ancestors did for millennia was eat foods that were rich in vitamin D so that they made sure they were getting the metabolite, and the body knew exactly how to convert the exact right amount of active D to keep things humming. And storage D has no basis of this. And I've got 3 clients right now whose storage D levels are between 95 and 105, and they are hot messes because they've been pounding vitamin D like there's no tomorrow. And it's calcified their body, and it's created all sorts of oxidative stress in their body, and their conventional practitioners are clueless about what's happened. And it cuts against the grain of the mainstream message where we're supposed to be drowning ourselves in this storage D, and it's supposed to be bringing us sunshine. It does not bring sunshine. It blocks sunshine. That's its job. It's a primal role that vitamin D has. It emerged hundreds of millions of years after retinol came on this planet. And its job is to block sunlight, and vitamin A is the sensor saying, please give me more sunlight.
So the confusing part for some of our listeners is, well, okay, so there's my vitamin D, and the world says, everyone in the world, like mainstream and the whole process is, of course you need vitamin D, and of course it's high doses. They're actually talking about, for clarification, the storage D form, and that's being measured in their labs.
Right.
And
doctors refuse to do the active.
Interesting. So they refuse to do the active.
And then do the active.
Let's talk about what happens when your D storage is high. It's taking up receptor sites for what?
Well, no, it's a great question. The receptor for vitamin A and D is binary. It's got to choose one or the other. And when it's being consumed and overwhelmed with D, there's no room for A in the end. And that's a serious problem. People don't know that the form of vitamin D, it's actually a hormone, we've had that conversation, but the form of the vitamin that's so important is the active form, again, connected to the vitamin D receptor, again, connected to RXR, and it's a triad that works together. And if they're not together, they don't work. It doesn't matter what your numbers are. So this is not openly discussed. Maybe it's not even understood fully by the practitioners. But as a group, as a rule, they do not test active. I've had some clients say that their doctor refused to do the active status, which I think I don't understand it at all. Mm-hmm. So again, name another hormone besides melatonin. Can you name another hormone that you can buy over the counter? name another hormone that you don't know both active and storage status for. It's the only hormone on the planet where they completely disregard the active state and they only focus on the storage state. And it creates chaos in the body when you do that.
Are you aware of the fact that women of the household make 80% of the health decisions? In my clinical experience of 27 years, I see way too many women struggling with hormonal, glandular, and chronic low energy and fatigue syndromes. How well can you be expected to lead when your health and energy are not where you need it? Thyroid, adrenal, and autoimmune diseases are all too common, and the real causes are not being addressed with drugs. There are natural ways to restore balance and ultimately reclaim your feminine physiology. If you're ready to learn and get results to better empower your health, healing, and that of your family, then we think you'll love this journey of discovery and lasting results. Check out The Feminine Carnivore on Facebook and join our 3- and 5-day challenges to reset your body's healing potential.
So if I'm looking at that, Morley, and it shows 25 OH vitamin D3.
Right. That's a storage form.
And then they have 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. That's also storage, correct?
No, 125 dihydroxy is the active state.
Okay, so I had my active state tested.
Okay.
My active, for example, before surgery was 49, and now it's currently close to 30 because I don't take it regularly.
Okay. And did you measure your storage at all?
No storage this time.
No storage this time?
Correct.
Okay. Did you do it before you had the surgery?
Yeah, I'd have to pull those out to see where those were. That's a big file.
I'll bet. So the rule of thumb is the active number, and again, they're measured in different units. Storage is measured in micrograms, and active is measured in picograms. But the number for active should be about 2 times the storage number.
Okay. All right, so let's pull a lab here from, we're in 2020 now. We rip these apart to send.
That's right, you just give me a number.
Yeah, if I can find it. All right, so going up here, unless I'm missing that sheet, let's go back to this one. Okay. 38.9.
Okay.
That was 2020. And then right around surgery, get my date squared away here. Actually, I'll go back further. Yes, here it is. $51.
51.6.
Yep.
So does the 51.6 relate to the 30?
That's in, actually it's micrograms. So that's vitamin D 25 hydroxy.
Right, but which is it, before surgery or after surgery?
Before, actually.
Okay, so that's showing a 1-to-1 relationship. It's actually below 1. So your storage was too high and your active was too low.
The surgeon looked at my labs and quoted, and he said, "Man, you're healthy." Yes, that's a paradox, folks. Just because my vitamin D levels looked high, he thought he's been trained that is the indicator.
Yeah, that's really sad. And it's like measuring someone's height and saying, "Wow, you're really healthy." Like, what? I mean, my height has nothing to do with my metabolic rate or my ability to convert foods into energy and things like that.
Great example. So the next thing we talked about, just to share some of this with folks, was if I had a practitioner look at my labs and they don't know any of my history. In fact, one doc that I consult with, she's amazing, but she deals with so many clients that she forgets. She's another provider, and I consult on labs. And she thought I was anemic. She's like, "I'm really concerned about your iron." Because
about your iron? Yeah, I'm really worried about your iron. So, how old are you again?
50. I'll be 52.
52. Let's do some math here. So 52 times 365. So Dr. Wade is clipping along at about 19,000 milligrams of iron in his body, and you should have 5,000. So it may be stuck in your tissue, but it's not missing from your body. It's just not showing up in your blood.
Great point. So what we're talking about, folks, is that as a hemochrome and doing
it's a term of endearment, right?
Yeah, it is a term of endearment.
I'm a copper chrome right here. It's a copper chrome.
Isn't there a song about that? Copper chrome? No, it's chrome.
Right.
So anyways, we're looking at what transferrin and iron saturation, serum iron, UIBC, TIBC, and transferrin. So I think I left out ferritin. But bottom line is a full iron panel versus what docs typically do.
Okay.
And most of your clinicians, for example, when they do a thyroid test, folks, they're from all the labs I've looked at, is they'll do TSH and they call that a thyroid panel. And if your TSH is in a range, then they're not gonna do any of the others, and they say your thyroid's fine. So they're not measuring T3, T4, reverse T3, free T3. So they're not looking up thyroid enzymes, the peroxidase, thyroglobulin. They're not looking at those typically, unless you ask and you request and you actually know what to ask for.
Right.
Coming back to this for iron, it's a similar scenario. They'll do ferritin or transferrin, but they rarely do the full panel, which tells you the whole story. And that's where Morley comes in. So I had phlebotomized, so dumped 3 times this year because I was back to about 34% saturation. And I my own experiment in playing with a healthy diet without shying away as a type O blood type from meats. And so I eat plenty of greens, plenty of vegetables. I'm a big fan. I love them, always have, but I also need enough carnivorous things to create my omnivorous balance.
Right.
And so my labs came down to a 10 in iron saturation, and in ranges for the audience, 15 is the lowest. That is the range according to the lab range. So that led to concern, as I shared with the doc. And then ferritin was low at 15 versus 33 for a male to 236.
Right.
And Morley has some ideas about this. And then overall, serum iron was also low at 34 versus 85. And so I'm not concerned.
Where's your transferrin?
Transferrin was 279.
Okay. And it's okay. So, and then what was your TIBC?
347.
Okay.
UIBC 313.
Okay. And where was your hemoglobin?
Hemoglobin is 12.4 actually. So
12.4. Okay. So 12.4 is a little below what you would expect in a guy. It should be around between 13 and a half and 14 and a half. So again, you could still donate at 12.5, but again, it's a little low in a male body. But the thing is, that's where 70% of the iron is in the body, is in the hemoglobin. So what happens is doctors, and so 70% is in hemoglobin. And what does that serum iron represent that gets to the percent saturation? That's less than 4% of the iron in the body. So they're making sweeping decisions about 4% and ignoring the 70% that's really accounting for the bulk of the iron in the body. So, but 12.4 is a little below ideal, but it's not, there's nothing critical about it. So we've got 70% there. Serum iron is 34, and ideally it should be 120 in a guy. If the guy's clipping along and everything's going fine. So again, we're talking about less than 4% of the iron in the body is in what's called a recycling program. Every day, every 24 hours, the body needs to come up with 25 milligrams of iron out of this bolus of 5,000 that we have. It's got to take 25 and devote it to the bone marrow to make a bazillion new red blood cells. So to put it in perspective for everybody, we make 2.5 million red blood cells every second. We've been talking now for 30 minutes. So 30 times 60, big number, right? So we're at 1,800. 1,800 times 2.5 million, right? And each red blood cell has 1 billion heme in it. And it's heme that's carrying the oxygen, that's providing oxygen for the tissue so it can make energy. So we're talking some really big numbers every second. And 25 milligrams of iron is needed to support those big numbers. So it's a little tiny bit of iron. And when that system is humming right, in a woman, the serum iron should show up at 100. In a guy, it should be about 120. And guys can take on more iron because we have more testosterone. It gives us an advantage. And that's why men, on average, are stronger and have more capacity to take on iron. It's because our testosterone is higher.
So what did you say in women? If men is 100 in the serum?
For women, it should be 100, and men should be 120.
120.
120. So your 34 is a notable decline in the recycling system. And then we get to your ferritin, and that's when the wheels will come off the discussion, because there's 4 different kinds of ferritin in the body. Okay? So we have three forms that are inside the cell, and 1 form is inside the blood. And what's in the cell is not the same as what's in the blood. So the cellular forms of ferritin, one is called ferritin heavy chain, and then there's mitochondrial ferritin, and they're very similar. One's inside the cell, one's inside the mitochondria. And both of those require bioavailable copper to load the iron in and let the iron out. And think of it as an ATM machine. We just need iron, we just need some iron for different cellular functions. Then, excuse me, Excuse me. Then we have another form inside the cell called ferritin light chain, and that has no copper enzyme. There's no ferroxidase enzyme function, and it strictly stores iron. So it's more like a bank vault. It's actually it's more like a savings account. Think of it as a savings account. Right.
When it comes to infrared sauna, the technology at Therasage360.com is on the forefront of delivering results safely and effectively. The technology in Therasage 360 is not only affordable and portable, it allows you to access the benefits of infrared technology on any budget. For a 15% discount on all products on Therasage360.com, use code FSDW360. You'll be glad you did.
When the body needs access to iron, it's going to send the ferritin over to the stomach of the cell called lysosome. And the lysosomes are going to grind it up and break down the protein to get access to the atoms of iron. And the ferritin protein can hold up to 4,500 atoms of iron. It's an enormous amount of iron. But if the lysosome doesn't have adequate copper, ding, 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 it can't produce adequate amounts of hydroperoxides, ding, ding, ding. And what happens is the iron gets discharged into the tissue, into the lysosomal tissue, and the ferritin gets cleaved, loses about 10 amino acids, and then gets secreted to go into the bloodstream. And the iron that sticks around becomes lipofuscin or hemosiderin, and that is the bank vault for iron. And the amount of iron in hemosiderin can be 10 times higher than the amount of iron in ferritin. And a good sign of rising hemosiderin in the body is you'll get big brown spots below your knee. It's a very obvious sign of hemosiderin. If you start to see these, like half the size of a dime on your legs, you should be really worrying about your iron status. And so the ferritin that goes into the blood is empty. The iron has already been discharged. So these are empty shotgun shells in the blood. And when the ferritin begins to go below 20, whether it's man or woman, I begin to suspect parasites in the spleen. And again, this isn't just pulling ideas out of a hair, or out of the air. It's based on some research where they clearly indicate that when the spleen is not functioning right, ferritin production will drop and it will show low in the blood. And what we're doing is we're taking one of the most sophisticated and most complicated parts of human physiology, and we're trying to reduce it to sound bites so that people who are worried about their mass can understand it. So again, we're really trying to parse this down into simple concepts, but it's going to fly in the face of the mainstream narrative, which is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. It's the exact opposite. And when copper is not bioavailable, iron cannot be functional. And functional iron presents as, in a guy, functional iron presents at 13.5 hemoglobin. Functional iron presents as serum iron of 120. Functional iron presents as serum ferritin around 20. And those are the three hallmarks, and percent saturation would be around 25%. So those are the four ways of measuring ideal iron status. And you're coming up short in a couple of them. So then it would beg the question, what was your copper status and what was your ceruloplasmin status?
Copper 93.
93. Okay.
Ceruloplasmin 21.6.
All right. There we
You
go.
want
Ding, ding, ding. We just found the problem.
Yeah.
So 93 divided by 21.6, and we get the number 4.31. And the ideal numbers are copper at 100, copper at 100, and ceruloplasmin at 30. And the ratio is 3.33. Now, what's important in your blood work is that the number for ceruloplasmin and the number for transferrin should be about the same number. The transferrin, I moved the decimal point over, and you said it was 279, so it's 27.9 compared to 21.6. They're not the same number.
Right.
Right? And so what's showing up is that your liver is not making optimal amounts of ceruloplasmin. And in part, there may be a number of factors. One that would immediately come to mind is the medication that you're taking may be a contributing factor. There may be something else in your diet that's getting in the way. It may be that we're coming off the heels of one of the most stressful periods of our lives. You personally have put yourself into the thick of the stress bucket with your work. And when we're under chronic stress, copper metabolism is going to take it on the chin. So under acute stress, we lose magnesium. But under copper stress, under chronic stress.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, good point. But under chronic stress, there's going to be an increased production of metallothionein. And it's interesting, I've just learned that it isn't just produced in the liver, it's also produced in the mucous cells of the enterocytes. So if we've got these two enterocytes, my hands, these are the villi, well, there's mucus that covers them. And the mucous cells have the ability to make metallothionein, which binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. Now, what will immediately cause metallothionein to increase is zinc supplements. But it turns out that chronic stress has almost an equal impact on the production of metallothionein. So Dr. Wade's been a stress cadet for over a year, and he's been in the thick of this controversy with the association. And I think it's taken its toll. And one of the things that I recommend to all of my clients is to do emotional freedom technique with practitioners to release the emotions and the fears that have built up during that period of chronic stress. Because when stress is chronic, we begin to get fearful. It creates anxiety. We may be really sophisticated and think, I got it under control, but at a subliminal level, our body's freaking out. And so we need to release those fears. Why? Because they cause us to become an acidic pH. And any farmer will tell you that acidic pH attracts iron. And then that iron is going to disrupt the copper metabolism that's trying to recycle the iron in your body. And so what I would do before I would subject you to an iron infusion, which I would never do, of course, but before we would even go that route, I would really have you redouble your efforts with the RCP and do a series of EFT sessions to release the unresolved emotions you have about the last 18 months that have affected you personally. Mm-hmm. And you're still coming off the stress of your surgery. You're still holding on to some level of fear. When was that operation?
Mid 19.
Okay, mid 19. So we're only 2 years out. And anytime someone has a serious condition that requires surgery, it's a very natural process for the human to go into fear of death. And we all have, at some level, we're going to die. We know that. But when you're a young Turk in your 50s, you don't like the idea of having to subject yourself to a scalpel. And especially someone who's as vital and really careful about their health as you were, you just didn't know you were hemochrome. And so it caught up with you. And the beauty of that experience, there is an upside, is you became aware about the importance of balancing minerals, and you've shared this wisdom with your patients, with your community. And that's really, really important for people who look up to you are learning from your example. And yeah, your numbers don't look right, but anemia is a very quickly diagnosed condition that's more often than not misdiagnosed. It's not properly diagnosed because people don't take the time to think through all of the variables. Because what we're looking at here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're looking at 12 variables, not just iron.
Right.
And the knee-jerk reaction by most practitioners, whether they're allopathic or alternative, is, oh, your numbers are low, you need iron. It's like, well, wait a minute. Maybe there are other factors. And let's talk about the stress I've been under. Let's talk about my diet. Let's talk about the fact that I'm 2 years out from surgery. Let's talk about this and that. And they don't, no. You just need more iron. And it's like, come on. Again, we're back to the most sophisticated, complicated part of human physiology. And it's completely dismissed. And so the last question I would have before we part is, what was your retinol and what was your storage D? Did you get those done?
Yeah, my storage, I didn't have my storage done this time. It was just the active at 30.
Okay.
And
that feels low to me.
Okay. And then, actually, I'm not sure if that was placed in the right column as these were transcribed. That might actually be. I'm going to verify that for you, whether it was active or storage. And
Okay.
the second thing I had vitamin A done, not retinol.
Okay.
And that was 58.7.
That's a very good retinol. That sounds good. And ideally, retinol should be 3 times storage D.
Okay.
And so if it turns out that 30 is your storage D, what was the time frame for this test?
Time frame. I'm sorry. What do you mean? Between this and the last?
No. What date was the blood work done?
Back on the 7th
of June.
June. Yep.
Okay. Have you been spending any time outside?
Yes.
Okay. So it could very well be that your storage D is elevated because of sunlight, which is fine. You have a more swarthy complexion than I've got. Like when I was younger, I was almost white. But you have more of a kind of a tannish glow. So you're probably going to have a slightly higher storage D because of that.
Well, and some of the characteristic folks with hemochromatosis is they called it the Marlboro Man, but it's basically the bronzing of the skin.
Exactly.
That would happen. And there was times when my iron was high that I never knew what that bronzing was, and it wasn't consistent. There would be patches. And so we were kind of fascinated once we found out about the hemochromatosis that all of a sudden those patches historically made sense, and they would come and go. So they weren't permanent. There's one thing I want to just share with the folks in Morley. You can add to this, but Morley wasn't really considering giving me an iron.
No.
This, by the way, yeah, just so you know, just because my iron is low, in my opinion, I overdumped. And that was my first synopsis was, okay, I went too far. I got to replenish again. But correct me if I'm wrong there, Morley, but what you're also noticing is that I'm just going to have anyone's going to have more iron problems. I specifically will have more iron challenges until I get my copper balance up in the body.
Right. And do you know where your T3 is? A more recent T3?
Yeah, and the T3, but there's a medication challenge I've been having there. And plus I use a natural form, just reminding. Okay. Doesn't mean there's not fillers in there, but it is the free or just T3?
Let's just do T3.
T3 is just low. It's 90, just under 90. From 100 to 180.
Yep.
And then free is also a little low, but the challenge I was having is missing some of it because they split my medication into a thyroid and a liothyronine. So I was taking it separate, and there would be occasions we split it for an experiment, and I would miss I'd miss the T3.
Okay. So there's a correlation. What people might be interested to know is that there's a study done by Jens, Jens, MyTag, MITTAG, from 2012, and they were studying the relationship between thyroid function and copper status. And it turns out that T3 is an oxygen sensor, and it's hanging out in the mitochondria. And when it's sensing that oxygen isn't being burned right, which means that the bioavailable copper is not optimal and too much oxidative stress is being produced, all hormones are signaling molecules. And T3 sends a signal back to the liver and says, we need more ceruloplasmin. So if your T3 is low, it's understandable that your ceruloplasmin would be on the low side. And that's exactly what we see. And that's the challenge you've got is in your situation, you're now kind of walking on stilts, having to balance out the medications so that your body gets the right signaling. And again, T3 or the thyroid does not run the body. Copper status runs the body. And if the T3 is off, there's going to be a downstream effect in terms of the liver's ability to get the right signal to know what to do. Does that make sense? And so,
taking that in, it's brand new for me to hear that part. That makes sense, though.
Yeah. And T4 tends to relate to the overall level of copper in the serum. So I'm going to bet that your T4 is probably closer to normal, and your serum copper is pretty close to normal, but your T3 is low and your ceruloplasmin is low.
Yep, that's correct. So we need to get the copper, we need to get the ceruloplasmin built up.
And I think part of it is, there's no question, there's a T3 part. I think there's an emotional part because of how stressful the last 18 months have been.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken its toll on everybody. But I know from our earlier conversations, it's had an impact on you.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's important to recognize that we pay a price for the stress we're in. And we're seeing it in your blood work. And, and it's being reduced by a conventionally trained practitioner to one mineral, when in fact we know there's a dozen variables that need to be considered. And we need to understand the gestalt of Dr. Wade, of what his life has been like over the last 18 months, to fully understand the energetic dynamics in your body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I know you have to hop here, so
yeah.
Thanks for looking at that, and I hope some of our listeners just get a piece of what's happening from this, just so they can ask better questions with their docs, so they can understand where we're going with this and why you actually care so much about how people understand this, because iron toxicity is more rampant, even in people that have been diagnosed as anemic. So
low iron on a blood test is a sign of high iron in the tissue where there's oxidative stress being created. Very important to understand that. Low iron in the blood means high iron in the tissue, and it's stuck in the tissue because the back door to let iron out into the recycling program, it's a copper dorman that opens it up. And if your ceruloplasm's low, then your copper dorman is going to be low too.
Got it. That's awesome. Awesome wrap.
All right. You have a great day, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, buddy. We'll talk in a couple weeks. I appreciate you.
You bet. Take care. Likewise. Bye-bye.
Okay, my fellow health warriors, it's time to head over to iTunes, franklyspeakingdrwade.com. There, you can rate, review, and subscribe, as well as share, so more of our brothers and sisters can grow to realize their voice and their health freedom. Speaking up means you matter, so get on it. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements or views expressed are not medical advice and are not meant to replace the advice of your medical doctor. This podcast, including Dr. Wade Anderson and his guests, disclaim responsibility for any adverse effects you may experience from the specific use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse and accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about the guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for such services or products. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical condition, consult your licensed physician.